The Stanley Hotel. The wind in Estes Park, Colorado, does not simply blow. It screams with a prehistoric, hollow hunger. It is a wind that has traveled across the jagged, frozen teeth of the Rocky Mountains, gaining speed, density, and ice before it finally slams into the whitewashed timber and red-shingled roofs of the Stanley Hotel. To the casual tourist arriving in the bright, golden light of a summer afternoon, the Stanley is a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, a grand, sprawling palace of elegance standing defiantly against the brutal wilderness. It looks like a painting. It looks like a postcard. But to those who have stayed long enough for the sun to dip behind the continental divide, leaving the valley in cold, purple twilight, the Stanley is something else entirely. It is a vessel. It is a massive wooden ribcage that holds a century of echoes. A place where the thin mountain air makes the veil between the living and the dead entirely translucent. I didn't go to the Stanley Hotel because I wanted to write a horror story. In fact, I went there to escape one. I was a freelance journalist coming off a brutal 2-year stint of covering true crime, and I was suffering from total psychological burnout. My editor told me to take a month off, take a vacation, go somewhere quiet. I believed that the extreme isolation of the mountains would act as a sanctuary, so I thought the haunted reputation of the hotel was nothing more than clever marketing, a Victorian-themed gimmick used to keep the rooms occupied during the lean, snowy months when the winding mountain roads were dangerous and the air was thin enough to make a person dizzy. I was arrogant in my skepticism. I believed that ghosts were just the byproduct of old wood settling in the cold and overactive imaginations fueled by too much bourbon and too little oxygen. The Stanley Hotel does not need marketing. It has a gravity all its own. Once you cross that threshold and the heavy brass and glass doors click shut behind you, cutting off the howl of the mountain wind, you are no longer just a guest. You are a witness to a history that refuses to stay buried. The very foundation of the hotel is built on solid quartz and granite bedrock. Anyone who studies the paranormal will tell you that quartz is a master conductor of energy. It absorbs, stores, and amplifies electromagnetic frequencies. Some say the ground beneath the Stanley itself acts as a massive geological battery, recording every scream, every laugh, every moment of terror, and every quiet tragedy that has occurred within these walls since Freelan Oscar Stanley first broke ground in 1907. F.O. Stanley came to this valley to die. He was suffering from severe tuberculosis, coughing up blood, given only months to live by his doctors. But the crisp, dry mountain air cured him. He built the hotel as a monument to his survival. It is a building literally founded on the defiance of death. Perhaps that is why the dead refuse to leave it. The drive up Route 36 from Denver is a transition from the modern world into something ancient. As the city falls away, the roads twist and turn, the elevation climbing so rapidly your ears pop. The trees grow thinner, more skeletal. And then, as you round a final bend into the Estes Valley, the hotel begins to loom over the landscape like a silent, watchful monarch. The bright red roof and the stark, surgical white walls look entirely unnatural against the gray granite and the dark, looming pines. When I finally pulled my car into the gravel lot, the wind was already picking up, whistling through the weather stripping of my car doors. I grabbed my bags and walked toward the grand veranda. Upon entering the lobby, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The transition from the freezing wilderness outside to the regal, stifling warmth inside was dizzying. Polished, dark wood, massive stone fireplaces crackling with pine logs, and the faint, constant sound of a piano playing somewhere in the distance. a melody that seemed to have no beginning and no end. I approached the front desk, my boots echoing loudly on the hardwood floor. The concierge was an older man with skin like parchment and pale eyes that seemed to have seen every guest who had ever checked in. He didn't greet me with the usual hospitality smile. He simply stared, a quiet look of assessment. "I have a reservation," I said, sliding my credit card across the polished counter. "Under Miller." He typed slowly on his keyboard. "Ah, yes, room 217, he said, his voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion. He didn't look at the computer screen. He looked directly at me. "Is there a problem with the room?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though a sudden, inexplicable knot had formed in my stomach. "Not at all," he replied, sliding a heavy, traditional brass key across the desk. The Stanley still uses actual keys. Electronic locks have a habit of failing here. It's our most requested suite. Mr. Stephen King stayed there in 1974, as you likely know. It was the inspiration for a very famous story. Just a word of advice. If you hear any tidying up in the middle of the night, don't be alarmed. Mrs. Wilson is very diligent about her duties. She doesn't like a messy room, and she doesn't like unmarried guests sharing a bed, though that shouldn't be an issue for you. He didn't explain who Mrs. Wilson was. He didn't have to. The air in the lobby seemed to drop by 10 degrees the moment her name left his lips. I took the elevator up. It is a beautiful, terrifying cage of gold leaf and iron that groans and shudders with the weight of its own history. The mechanical whine of the cables sounded like a slow, ascending scream. When the doors parted on the second floor, the hallway stretched out before me, long, wide, and lined with doors perfectly spaced, retreating into a vanishing point that made my eyes ache. Room 217 is not just a room, it is the psychic epicenter of the Stanley. In 1911, during a powerful spring storm, the hotel lost power. The head chambermaid, Elizabeth Wilson, was sent to light the acetylene gas lamps in the guest rooms. She didn't know there was a leak. When she entered room 217 and struck a match, the resulting explosion was catastrophic. The blast destroyed the entire floor of the suite, dropping Elizabeth into the McGregor ballroom directly below. Her ankles were shattered, her body broken. She survived the blast, miraculously, and the Stanleys paid for her medical care. She returned to work after she healed, serving the Stanley Hotel until her death in the 1950s. But many believe she never actually clocked out. When I unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the silence of an empty apartment or a quiet library. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a held breath. It was the feeling of walking into a room where a conversation has just abruptly ended and the participants are still standing there, entirely invisible, watching you move. I unpacked my bags with a growing sense of unease. I am a creature of strict habit. I like my things exactly where I put them. I lined my shoes up neatly by the closet door, placed my laptop centrally on the mahogany desk, and hung my winter coat on the brass hook in the entryway. I spent the afternoon at that desk, attempting to write, watching the sun set behind the snow-capped peaks. The shadows in the room didn't just grow longer as the light faded. They seemed to grow thicker, stretching across the floral carpet like ink spilling into water. I fell asleep around 11 o'clock, the wind outside battering the glass of the large, historic windows. I woke up at exactly 3:14 a.m. I know the exact time because the red, glaring digits of the digital alarm clock seemed to be the only thing visible in the suffocating darkness of the suite. I woke to the sound of a zipper. It was a slow, rhythmic, metallic rasping. Rip, rip. It was the sound of my own canvas suitcase being opened. I sat up, my skin prickling with a sudden freezing sweat. The room's temperature had plummeted. I could see my own breath hitching in the air, a white mist illuminated faintly by the red glow of the clock. I looked toward the wooden luggage rack near the foot of the bed. My suitcase, which I had zipped entirely shut and pushed against the wall, was now sitting squarely in the middle of the rack, wide open. I didn't see a person. There was no glowing apparition, no translucent figure standing in the corner. But I saw the fabric of my shirts lifting into the air. They rose smoothly, silently, as if held by steady, invisible, practiced hands. I watched, my brain completely unable to process the geometry of the impossible, as my clothes were folded in midair, perfect, sharp, department store creases, and placed in neat, meticulously organized stacks beside the suitcase. Next, my shoes, which I had left by the closet, slid across the carpet with a soft shh sound and tucked themselves neatly side by side, perfectly parallel to the bed frame. I couldn't scream. My throat felt like it had been packed with dry sand. When the last pair of socks was folded and stacked, the suitcase lid lowered itself slowly, and the zipper pulled itself shut with a final, decisive metallic click. Then, the pressure on the mattress changed. I felt the heavy, distinct weight of someone sitting down at the very foot of my bed. I saw the thick white duvet compress inward. It wasn't the light weight of a child or a stray animal. It was the solid, undeniable weight of a grown woman. The fabric of the mattress groaned slightly. "I'm just a guest," I whispered into the dark. My voice sounded pathetic, small, like a child trying to negotiate with a nightmare. The weight remained for a long, agonizing minute. I could feel the cold radiating off the invisible presence, sweeping over my shins like a draft from an open freezer. I held my breath, afraid that the slightest movement would provoke it. Then, slowly, the mattress rose. The fabric unwrinkled. The weight was gone. The freezing air retreated toward the door, and I heard the faint, distinct sound of a woman humming a low, tuneless melody as she walked through the solid wood of the hallway door. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat up against the headboard with every lamp in the room turned on, watching the closet door, waiting for the sun to rise and break the spell. The next morning, the hotel felt fundamentally different. The grand luxury of the daylight had been replaced by a sense of stifling, oppressive history. The Stanley is not a hotel. It is a museum where the exhibits can touch you. I had black coffee in the dining room, sitting alone at a small table. I noticed that the steam from my cup didn't rise straight up. It drifted sharply toward the empty chair across from me, as if pulled by a draft, or perhaps inhaled by someone I couldn't see. Desperate to get out of room 217, I decided to explore the hotel. The concierge had mentioned the concert hall, a separate building on the property built by F.O. Stanley as a gift for his beloved wife, Flora. Flora was a classically trained pianist, and the concert hall was her domain. The walk to the concert hall was freezing, the snow crunching loudly beneath my boots. Inside, the hall was grand, echoing, and entirely empty. Rows of antique wooden chairs faced a beautifully restored stage. Sitting center stage was a magnificent Steinway grand piano. I walked down the center aisle, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air in here smelled intensely of old paper, dust, and a very distinct, overpowering scent of rosewater perfume. I stood near the front row, while admiring the craftsmanship of the stage, when I heard the heavy backstage door swing shut on its own, a loud, echoing slam that rattled the windows. "Hello?" I called out. My voice bounced off the plaster walls. No one answered. But then, the piano began to play. It didn't plink a few random notes like a draft hitting the strings. It began to play a complex, sweeping, mournful waltz. The keys depressed themselves with practiced, elegant force. I stood frozen in the aisle, or watching the ivory keys dance up and down. The rosewater scent grew so thick it was almost choking. I realized I was intruding on a private performance. Flora Stanley had passed away in 1939, but in her concert hall, time had simply stopped. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the piano. As I reached the heavy double doors at the back of the hall, I heard a man's voice whisper directly into my right ear. It was a gruff, working man's voice. "Get out, Ma, she's practicing." I didn't turn around. I pushed through the doors and ran back into the freezing Colorado air, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I would later learn from a historical tour guide that the concert hall is heavily guarded by the spirit of Paul, a loyal handyman who worked for the Stanleys for decades. Even in death, Paul enforces an absolute curfew around Flora's piano. By the afternoon of my second day, I realized I was trapped in a labyrinth. The hallways of the Stanley seemed to stretch longer than the building's exterior should physically allow. The geometry of the place felt wrong. I found myself wandering toward the fourth floor. In the early days of the Stanley Hotel, the fourth floor was essentially a massive attic. It was where the children of the wealthy guests were kept, out of sight, along with their nannies. It was also where the female employees slept. The architecture here is entirely different from the grand luxury of the lower floors. The ceilings are low, sloping inward. The corridors are narrow, claustrophobic, and lined with dozens of doors. The air up here feels thick, dead, and heavy. As I walked down the long, dim hallway toward room 401, I heard it. Laughter. It was clear, bright, high-pitched laughter. The sound of children playing tag. I stopped dead in my tracks, leaning my back against the vintage wallpaper. There were no families checked into this wing of the hotel. I knew this for a fact. The entire fourth floor was supposedly closed for winter maintenance. Then came the sound of the ball. Thump, thump, thump. It was the dull, heavy thud of a rubber ball hitting the wooden floorboards. It started at the far end of the hall, near the service stairs, and began to move steadily toward me. The sound was accompanied by the rapid, frantic patter of small, bare feet running on the carpet. I stood frozen as the sound grew louder, the vibrations traveling through the floorboards and directly into the soles of my boots. Thump, thump, thump. The pattering feet sped up. The sound rushed toward me, impossibly fast, and stopped exactly at the toes of my boots. I looked down. The red patterned carpet was empty. There was no ball. There were no children. "Is someone there?" I whispered into the empty hallway. The silence that followed was absolute suffocating vacuum. Then, a sharp, delighted giggling erupted right next to my left ear. It was so close, I felt the faint, icy puff of breath against the hair on my neck. At the same moment, a tiny, freezing hand grabbed my pant leg and tugged hard. I gasped, stumbling backward against the wall. I looked down, but there was nothing holding me. I turned and bolted for the grand staircase. I didn't wait for the groaning elevator. I took the stairs 2 at a time, fleeing the 4th floor, desperate to get back to the lobby where there were lights, people, and the illusion of the modern world. But the Stanley wasn't finished with me. That evening, a sudden, violent blizzard blew in from the peaks. It was a true Rocky Mountain whiteout. The snow fell so fast and thick that you couldn't see 10 feet out the windows. Within hours, the local authorities had closed Route 36 and the mountain pass. The roads were impassable. I went to the front desk, panicking, demanding to check out. The same pale-eyed concierge looked at me with a mixture of pity and grim amusement. "I'm afraid you're staying with us tonight, Mr. Miller. No one is getting down the mountain until the plows come through tomorrow afternoon. We are completely snowed in." I was trapped. The hotel had become a locked box. I retreated to room 217, knowing I had no other choice. I locked the door, slid the brass deadbolt, and pushed the heavy mahogany armchair in front of the entrance. I lay on top of the covers, half fully dressed in my jeans and sweater, listening to the hotel breathe. And the Stanley does breathe. The old timber moans as it expands and contracts in the freezing cold. The antique plumbing pipes hum with a low-frequency vibration that makes your teeth ache, and the wind outside howled with the sound of 100 starving wolves. Around midnight, the scratching started. It wasn't the sound of a mouse in the walls. It was the sound of fingernails, human fingernails, dragging slowly and deliberately down the inside of the solid wooden closet door. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I sat up slowly, my blood turning to ice. I didn't get out of bed. I stared at the closet. "Mrs. Wilson?" I managed to say. "Please, I kept the room clean." The scratching stopped instantly. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a predatory pause. Then a voice spoke. But it didn't come from the closet. It came from directly under my bed. It was a man's voice, raspy and dark. "She's not here right now, but I am." My heart stopped. I threw myself off the mattress, scrambling backward until my spine hit the wall near the window. I stared at the dark gap beneath the bed frame, expecting a hand to reach out and grab my ankle. Nothing moved. Then, the bathroom door swung open with a violent, terrifying creak. I heard the heavy brass taps squeak as they were turned. The bathtub began to fill. I could hear the steaming water rushing, yes, splashing against the cold porcelain basin. I couldn't run out the front door. I had barricaded it, and it would take too long to move the chair. I was cornered. I grabbed my heavy metal flashlight from my bag and crept toward the open bathroom door. The room was already thick with a dense, white steam that smelled overwhelmingly of old lye soap and rotting flowers. I stepped onto the tiled floor. The bathtub was overflowing, the scalding water spilling over the edges and soaking my boots. I reached through the scalding steam and violently twisted the brass taps shut. The sudden silence in the bathroom was deafening. I slowly turned my head and looked at the large mirror above the sink. It was completely fogged over with steam. But as I watched, letters began to appear in the condensation. They weren't being written from the outside by a phantom finger. They were being traced from inside the glass, the moisture clearing away to form jagged, desperate, frantic strokes. G-E-T-O-U-T. Before I could even process the words, a shape emerged in the mirror. It was standing directly behind me. It was a man, but his face was completely obscured by shadow. He was wearing a tall, antique top hat and a long coat. He reached his arm out in the reflection, pointing a long, skeletal finger at the back of my head. It was Lord Dunraven. The man who had owned the land before the Stanleys, a notoriously greedy and cruel man whose spirit is said to haunt the hotel, was angry that his empire was taken from him. I didn't turn around to look at him in the room. I knew if I looked at him in the physical world, my mind would snap. I bolted, I threw the mahogany chair away from the front door with strength I didn't know I possessed, unlocked the deadbolt, and sprinted out into the hallway. I spent the rest of that night sitting on the floor of the main lobby, directly beside the roaring fireplace. The night auditor didn't ask why I was there. He didn't ask about the sheer terror written all over my face. He simply walked over, handed me a heavy wool blanket and a cup of lukewarm chamomile tea. "First time seeing Dunraven?" he asked, his voice almost kind. "Last time," I replied, my voice cracking, my hands shaking so badly the tea spilled over the rim of the cup. He smiled, a slow, knowing, terrifying smile. "That's what they all say, friend. But the Stanley has a way of calling you back. You took a piece of it with you when you looked in that mirror. It's in your blood now. You'll hear our wind even when you're 1,000 miles away. You'll see these white walls in your dreams." When the snowplows finally cleared the mountain pass at noon the next day, I didn't wait for the sun to fully shine. I threw my bags into my car, the tires spinning violently in the slush, and I drove down the mountain like a man possessed. I didn't look back at the white palace on the hill. I didn't want to see a face staring at me from the window of room 217. I drove for 4 hours straight until I reached the flat, safe plains of Denver. I pulled into a gas station to fill my tank. I reached into my passenger seat to grab my wallet. Sitting directly on top of my wallet, neatly folded into a perfect, crisp, incredibly precise square, was a single white hand towel. Embroidered in the center, in elegant gold thread, were the words, "The Stanley Hotel." I hadn't packed it. I hadn't even gone back into the bathroom to get my toiletries. I picked up the towel with 2 trembling fingers and threw it directly into the gas station trash can. I drove home in a state of shock. But even now, months later, safely back in my apartment, the nightmare isn't over. I'll wake up at exactly 3:14 a.m. I'll hear the distinct metallic sound of a suitcase zipper in the corner of my dark bedroom. I'll feel the heavy, undeniable weight of a mattress dipping at the foot of my bed. Now I'll hear the faint, distant laughter of children playing in a hallway that shouldn't exist. The stories we tell about haunted houses aren't just words. They are invitations. Some places are so full of sorrow, memory, and trapped energy that they overflow their physical boundaries. They follow you home in the tread of your shoes and the folds of your clothes. They wait for you in your own bathroom mirrors. They whisper to you in the hallways of your own house. While the Stanley Hotel is a masterpiece of architecture, yes, it is a landmark of American history. But it is also a trap. It is a web woven of quartz, wood, and time, designed to catch the souls of those who are arrogant enough to look into its shadows. It is a place where the dead are far more alive than the living, and where the living are merely ghosts waiting for their turn. If you go there, go with absolute respect. Go with your eyes wide open. Do not mock the history. Do not taunt the concert hall. And for God's sake, keep your suitcase zipped and your room tidy. Because Mrs. Wilson is very diligent about her work, and she is never, ever finished. If you want to hear more long-form, terrifying, haunted stories like this one, make sure to hit that notification bell. We have many more deep dives into the dark corners of America coming up. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel to support these stories and keep the campfire burning. Every subscription helps us dig deeper into the mysteries that haunt our history. You have been listening to American Haunted Tales. Stay safe, stay curious, and whatever you do, don't look in the mirror in the dark.
Thank you for watching.